Hi, I'm Linda Lundstrom, and I'm leaving this video because I just thought I wanted to share something with you. You know, we're watching the news and reading the papers about all of the unrest in the United States, and it's very easy to say, well, gee, isn't it terrible what's happening down there? But my message today is that we're in no position to judge another country when there's so much that we have to be better at and fix and do better here in Canada. I grew up in a racist community. I grew up in the Red Lake area of northwestern Ontario in a little gold mining town called Cochenour. And when the gold rush happened and people from, my father's family was from Sweden, my mother's from Iceland, Poland, the Ukraine, Scotland, Ireland, Italy, Germany, all those immigrants that went up to that area to work in the gold mines just kind of moved in and took over the land that was occupied by Indigenous people for thousands of years. I was born and raised there. And as a child growing up, I witnessed racism. I saw it in the school, in the church, in the community, on the police force, and in my home. My mother loved everybody and everybody loved her. She was not a racist, but she did laugh at jokes that were made at the expense of Indigenous people. We all did. My father was a racist, and as a child, I looked up to him. I mean, he was my dad. He was a big, strong man, and I learned a lot from him. And his racism rubbed off on me. And I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I stood silent when an Indigenous person was being ridiculed or the target of racist words or actions. I stood by silently. I didn't go to that person's defense. I kept quiet, and it's as much an act of racism to be a witness to racism and not do anything as it is to be the actual perpetrator yourself. And that left me with a deep sense of guilt and shame. When I left at the age of 17 to go to Sheridan College to study fashion design, I carried that guilt and shame with me. Fast forward to 33 years ago when I had my first child. And there was this baby in my arms. And this amazing thing happened. I looked down at that child, and all of the memories of the racism that I had experienced and observed, etc., came flooding back into my consciousness because I had buried them. I didn't want to deal with it. They came flooding back into my consciousness, and it was like a catharsis, and I just started bawling because what came bubbling up was that shame and guilt in all its ugliness. And I looked down at this beautiful, innocent baby, and I realized that I had learned racism, and I needed to unlearn it. And I needed to make sure that nothing like that could happen in my home with my children. The kind of racism that I experienced in my home. Now, at the age of 11 or 12, when I began to challenge my dad for some of his statements, some of his beliefs, that did not go over well. So just be prepared that if you're challenging somebody who's a racist and who may not even think of themselves as a racist, but if you start challenging them, they will not thank you. They are not going to like it. But you have to press on. You have to keep trying to make people wake up. But the most important person to wake up is yourself. Examine, do I have any racial biases? Do I have any Indigenous friends? Do I have any friends of color? Do I know anything about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was, the findings were brought down and 93 calls to actions were identified? Do I know anything about that? What about the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls? Do I know what that is? Like, what was that? That was racism. We all each need to educate ourselves and challenge ourselves about our own biases before we point the finger at anybody else or another country and say, oh, they're so screwed up. Look at what's happening down there in Minneapolis. Look what's happening. It's happening here too. We have nothing to be pompous about or nothing. We've got lots of work to do here, and in particular, the situation that exists with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people who are afraid to send their kids to high school in Thunder Bay because of the violence that's happened to young teenagers, being found dead. There's communities where there's no running water, and communities that do have running water often can't drink the water. We have a tremendous disparity right now in the standard of living between privileged white people like myself and Indigenous people. And I've dedicated my entire life to trying to make a difference in that respect. Some of the people that I went to high school with and public school with, Indigenous people, when we lived together up in Kosher, we didn't really speak, we didn't socialize, there was this separation. Thankfully, I've now connected with some of those people and they've enriched my life. And more importantly, when I asked for forgiveness for my racism as a child growing up and on behalf of my father, they forgave me. And so with each situation that I encountered in this quest to deal with the shame and guilt, I have been rewarded with the most wonderful relationships with Indigenous people, and they've enriched my life tremendously. So my message today is that starting with yourself, ask yourself, do I know any Indigenous people? Do I have a group of friends that represent the mix of racial groups that have made this country into the most wonderful cultural mosaic that is recognized around the world? Is that reflected in my own circle of friends? And to ask yourself what small steps you can take to broaden your worldview and to deal with any racial biases that you may have. And you know what? It's not easy. And it's a process that never ends. It hasn't ended for me, and I don't think it ever will. But I wish you luck, and I know that if we all do this, the world will be the revised, new vision reality that we all long for. So that's my story. Take care.